Did you ever wonder if the sins of forgotten men still echo beneath the dust of centuries? Tonight we will live a life in the shadowed corridors of medieval crime, where names carved in secrecy slipped through alleyways of old Europe like ghosts born from hunger and ambition. Here the world was a tapestry of flickering candles, cold iron, and souls tangled between survival and sin. In these dim and breathless passages, we walk, not beside monsters, but broken men shaped by kingdoms, famine, and longing. But before we begin this journey, don't forget to subscribe this channel and comment name of your hometown. Leave your whispers in the comments. And if this story speaks to you, light a candle with a like. Now, get comfortable. The past is waiting. In the dim marrow of medieval Europe, crime was not merely an act, but a quiet evolution of despair, born in seasons when harvests failed and kings fought wars that drained the breath from everyday lives, leaving villages cracked open like dry earth. Our path begins in the worn streets of 12th century London, where the name Eustace, the monk, drifted like smoke through taverns. A man once sworn to holy silence, who abandoned scripture for shadows when treachery hollowed out the last purity of his faith. He had been a Benedictine servant, shaped by candlelit halls and the echo of slow bells, but the death of his father stripped him of solace, and he stepped into the world of lawless tides, as if pulled by a current older than destiny. He became a pirate, slipping across the English Channel with a cloak black as storm water. Not for glory, but for revenge, for a wound that time refused to cleanse. Ships whispered of him as a spectre whose footsteps were lighter than sea mist. A man who wielded cunning rather than steel, and whose crimes were born from a grief that stained him deeper than ink. As he moved between ports, his legend devoured his past identity until even he could no longer recall where the monk ended and the outlaw began. Yet woven beneath the violence was a quiet truth that few dared acknowledge. That Eustace was not driven by cruelty, but by a longing to reclaim what fate had shattered, to shape chaos into meaning. In these early years of medieval infamy, crime lived not as spectacle, but as a fragile thread binding men to the world after everything sacred had been taken. But while Eustace carved his legacy across the Channel, another figure emerged in the heart of Paris, a woman known only by fragments of memory. Marie, the poisoner, whose hands moved with the precision of an apothecary, while her heart moved with the ache of an orphaned soul. She lived among vials and dried herbs, the air around her scented with rosemary and bitter almond. And though history etched her name with cold condemnation, few remembered how she had once been a healer. In a city where nobility feasted while peasants starved, she found herself slipping between roles. Healer to some, deliverer of quiet endings to others, until the lines between mercy and crime dissolved like ink in rainwater. These figures, whose names trembled on parchment, remind us that medieval criminals were not demons in the dark, but mirrors reflecting the wounds of their time, shaped by hunger, grief, betrayal, and the relentless machinery of power. Their lives unfurled like candle smoke curling into unseen shapes, tracing patterns that the world refused to understand. As we walk alongside them, we do not seek to justify their actions, but to breathe in the forgotten atmosphere of an era where survival often demanded that morality bend like frost-touched reeds. And so the story begins with two souls already lost to the labyrinth, wandering corridors carved by their own unraveling, leaving footprints that centuries would try and fail to erase. The world of medieval crime deepened as shadows lengthened across the continent, and the stories of those bound to sin twisted like ancient roots. Beneath cathedral floors, each life shaped by forces heavier than the weight of any blade they carried. When Eustace and Marie were whispered across markets and monasteries, another name drifted through the cracked tapestry of the age, a man whose crimes were carved not in fury but in cold patience. Hereward, the Wake, once a noble rebel whose path through England turned from resistance to outlawry, as conquest reshaped the kingdom into a vessel for new rulers. Cast away from land and legacy, he moved through marshlands like a faded banner, refusing surrender. His figure glimpsed through fog as if the land itself mourned the loss of its guardians. Though his early defiance held purpose, the world tightened around him until rebellion became survival, and survival became crime, and soon he lingered in the mind of the realm as both hero and menace. His actions were woven with the ache of a displaced soul watching the future devour the world he once belonged to, and so he fought not as a criminal in the common sense, but as one whose heart was torn between memory and the cold advance of change. As England turned into a field of shifting loyalties, France carried its own shadows in the shape of cart thieves and wandering brigands who roamed the vast countryside seeking coin to stave off hunger that buried itself in bone. Among them rose a figure both feared and pitied, Gigam Leroux, whose childhood famine etched lines into his spirit long before he held a blade. He moved with the desperation of a man trapped between life and oblivion, and villagers whispered his name with trembling caution, though those who ever looked into his eyes claimed to see not cruelty but the bottomless exhaustion of a man history never gave a chance. And in the colder corners of Europe where forests breathed ancient secrets, another criminal shaped his path in silence. Matthias the Raven, a thief whose presence carried a chill like morning frost on stone. Cloaked always in black, he glided through monasteries and noble halls, stealing relics, not out of greed, but because he believed each relic held a fragment of the world stolen from the poor. His actions stitched him into the fabric of a mythic figure, neither wholly villain nor savior, yet forever drifting between the two worlds, stepping softly where candlelight failed. The medieval era did not create these souls out of darkness, but out of imbalance, out of kingdoms tilted toward power and suffering, leaving ordinary lives crushed beneath the turning wheels of fate. And it is here, in the quiet corners of their stories, that we begin to grasp the deeper truth of their existence, that their crimes were echoes of wounds the world refused to heal, and that behind every act lay a fracture in the human heart carved by loss, hunger, fear, or solitude. These outlaws did not roam as legends then, but as men and women whose breath fogged the same cold air, whose hands trembled under the weight of choices, and whose footsteps left marks quickly erased by the winds of the age. Yet centuries later, their names survive, not because their sins were grand, but because their stories held the raw thrum of humanity stripped bare. They remind us that even among stone prisons, gallows and royal decrees, the medieval world was filled with souls searching for meaning in a landscape where dignity was a fragile and fleeting light. As the centuries unfurled their dim parchment, the medieval world carved even darker corridors, where desperation grew like vines, clinging to abandoned towers, and the line between survival and sin thinned to a whisper carried by cold winds. In the trading hubs of the Mediterranean, where ships creaked with spices, silk and secrets, the name Rahman of Tunis surfaced like a ripple. Disturbing calm waters, a strategist of the underworld who mastered the silent art of moving forbidden goods through ports watched by eyes both holy and ruthless. His life began not as a criminal, but as a scholar, lost to political ruin, cast out into a world that had no place for displaced knowledge seekers, and so he learned the rhythm of shadows until commerce itself became his pen and the coastline his parchment. Through him we see how medieval crime often grew from the ashes of broken opportunity, becoming a refuge for minds too sharp to survive within rigid hierarchies. Across the Adriatic, another tale unfurled in the alleys of Venice, where narrow bridges hovered over black water and masks drifted in smoky torchlight. Here lived Fioretta, La Lince, a woman whose sight was said to pierce intentions with uncanny clarity, shaped by years of living in a city where secrets were currency and anonymity, a shield more durable than any sword. She navigated the world of clandestine trade, intercepting coded messages and retrieving stolen letters before the dawn bells rang across the canals, and though she was feared as a thief, her actions threaded through a deeper longing for control over a life once dictated by powerful families that ignored the fragility of those beneath them. Her crimes were crafted like delicate lace, subtle, deliberate, almost mournful, echoing the beauty and burden of a city built on water. Meanwhile, in the cold Germanic lands, where forests stretched like endless cathedrals and villages huddled close for warmth, a figure known as Klaus the Wanderer left traces of his existence in half-forgotten folktales. He slipped through towns with the quiet sorrow of a man who carried too many winters in his bones, and though he was hunted for countless thefts, those who encountered him whispered that he only stole from those who exploited the poor, and that he often left bread or coins where he took valuables. Klaus was not a romantic hero, but a soul bruised by a world unable to understand the weight of fairness, pressing against the sternum of a man who had seen too many injustices committed by those seated in comfort. Yet the medieval age was not shaped solely by individuals who drifted through land and sea, for its cities carved their own criminals through systems that crushed dreams before they formed. In the bustling streets of Florence, where artisans carved beauty from marble and merchants bartered under fresco-painted arches, many young men were pushed into the underworld by debts inherited rather than earned. The city forged its own brand of outlaw. Men like Niccolo del Vento, who earned his reputation not through violence but through vanishing into the labyrinthine alleys after redistributing stolen wealth to families burdened by the cruel math of survival. His story threads itself into the tapestry of those whose crimes arose not from hatred but from witnessing too much suffering and feeling powerless to reshape the balance by any legitimate means. These lives, scattered across continents and centuries, remind us that medieval crime was seldom born from malice but from the slow erosion of hope, the tightening grip of power structures, and the unending struggle of humans, seeking even the faintest spark of control in worlds drowning beneath uncertainty. Each outlaw carried a private ache that breathed beneath their actions, shaping their existence into something both tragic and inevitable. And their stories are not warnings but mirrors, showing us how fragile the boundary is between ordinary life and paths carved by necessity, desperation, or grief. As the medieval world shifted beneath crowns, wars, plagues, and endless tides of migration, crime evolved like a shadow, learning new forms. With each passing decade and its stories curled through monasteries, marketplaces, and battle-scarred fields like quiet breaths drawn in dim candlelight. In the kingdoms of the north, where icy winds carved lines across the faces of shepherds and kings alike, the figure known as Ingrid the Silent left a trail of whispers across Norway and Denmark. She had once been a fisherman's daughter, taught to read the currents of both water and human nature, but when famine seized her village, she stepped into a harsh world that offered no mercy. Her thefts were precise, shaped by necessity rather than greed, and though noble records condemned her as a menace, villagers remembered her as the woman who left food for widows, even as she fled mounted patrols through frozen woods. In her story, we see how crime often blossomed where governments failed to protect their weakest, becoming not rebellion but a cold survival instinct etched into bone. Farther south, in the Iberian Peninsula, during the fractured era of rival kingdoms, a man named Salvador the Vagrant shaped his legacy through the art of vanishing, reappearing only long enough to disrupt the wealth of traveling nobles who taxed the poor with impunity. He drifted through orange groves, monasteries, and caravan routes like a restless ghost driven not by thrill, but by the heavy memory of losing his family to a feud orchestrated by lords who never faced consequence. His life became a quiet testament to those who felt the law served only the powerful, leaving the common folk unshielded from injustice. Even beyond Europe, the medieval world formed its own tide of notorious figures, such as Behrouz the Falconer in Persia, a former palace servant whose intimate understanding of royal routines allowed him to orchestrate daring robberies that unsettled entire courts. Yet beneath his sharp precision lay the heartbreak of a man cast out after refusing to betray a friend wrongfully accused. His crimes became an expression of loyalty, twisted by fate, a mourning song carved into the politics of a world that rarely forgave defiance. In the narrow corridors of Cairo, where dust danced in golden rays of morning light and markets echoed with prayer, another outlaw emerged. Layla of the Lantern Market, a woman whose calm expression concealed a lifetime of wounds. Forced into the trade of forged documents, she eventually used her skill to create false identities for those escaping oppressive taxes or arranged punishments. Though the authorities hunted her as a forger, many who lived in the slums saw her as a quiet refuge, a flicker of mercy in a city where the divide between wealth and poverty spread wider with each new decree. Her tale echoes the truth that not all crimes sought gold, some sought to preserve dignity in places where it was stripped away. Across these landscapes, from cold fjords to desert cities, the same pattern appears again and again. The medieval criminal, often shaped not by hunger for power, but by systems indifferent to suffering. By rulers whose visions of order demanded sacrifices paid by common souls. Their lives flicker like candles in abandoned chapels, each flame trembling under the weight of choices made in the dark, where no path is free of consequence. As these stories weave together, a deeper understanding forms that the medieval underworld was not a world apart, but intertwined with everyday life, revealing how fragile safety and morality became when the world itself was constantly shifting. Under storms of war, plague, and inequality, these outlaws and wanderers remain carved in memory because their existence forces us to confront the ancient truth that when society fractures its people, fracture with it, leaving behind shards that carve unexpected paths through history. As we drift deeper into the medieval underworld, the stories grow heavier, like damp parchment, absorbing centuries of sorrow, and each name etched into history carries not only infamy, but the silent ache of lives shaped by forces they never controlled. In the fractured heart of the Balkans, where mountains stood like ancient sentinels and empires collided with brutal persistence, the figure known as Drogon, the boundary keeper, emerged as both menace and martyr. Once a village guard tasked with watching over narrow passes, he turned to ambush when foreign armies seized his home, leaving behind ashes where his childhood fields once swayed. His crimes were carved into ledgers by foreign scribes who never witnessed the grief that pushed him into rebellion, and though his raids stirred fear among merchants, he often spared those who traveled with families, knowing too well the weight of loss. His legacy reminds us that crime in turbulent lands often rose from the rubble of war and displacement. Meanwhile, in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, where towns grew under the gaze of towering cathedrals, a guild scribe named Otto of Regensburg stepped quietly into a life of manipulation, forging seals and twisting documents that altered inheritances, marriages, or freedoms with a single deceptive stroke. His transformation from dutiful record keeper to shadowy architect did not spring from greed, but from watching countless peasants trapped by paperwork they could neither read nor challenge, and he became a ghostly adversary of the system itself. Though condemned for fraud, many whispered that he altered the fate of more poor families than any noble ever cared to. His story reveals how crime sometimes rose from compassion, tangled in a net of flawed execution. Farther west, in the rugged lands of the Scottish Highlands, a woman known as Elspeth of the Heather Moors left behind a legacy that blurred the line between outlaw and wanderer. After her clan was scattered by political feuds, she survived through wayfaring thefts and quiet acts of resistance, moving through mist-covered hills with a resolve carved from heartbreak. She stole not objects of luxury, but food blankets or livestock needed to shield fragile communities from starvation during harsh winters. And though the crown named her a criminal, generations of locals told stories of her footsteps as blessings in times of need. Her tale whispers that even in worlds ruled by iron and decree, the human spirit sought to protect what little remained sacred. Southward in the sun-scorched lands of Castile, a young man called Mateo. The ink hand shaped his notoriety not through blade or ambush, but through the meticulous crafting of counterfeit travel passes that allowed persecuted groups to escape regions torn by suspicion and religious strife. His ink-stained fingers became symbols of quiet rebellion, and though authorities declared him a threat to order, many refugees remembered him as the silent guardian who gave them new beginnings under the weight of stars that once felt hostile. Mateo reminds us that medieval criminals often carried a deeper yearning to mend what authorities refused to acknowledge. Through these stories, spanning mountains, deserts, cathedrals, and coastal towns, a pattern reveals itself like constellations, faint but persistent across time. That medieval crime often emerged not from the hunger for domination, but from fractures created by suffering, injustice, displacement, or despair. These figures were neither heroes nor villains, but fragile threads, woven into a tapestry where human choices were shaped by the pressure of survival. Their lives echo the same truth that has followed humanity through centuries, that when the world becomes too heavy, ordinary souls bend, and when it becomes unbearable, they break, forming paths history later struggles to untangle. As the medieval centuries rolled onward, like a slow-turning wheel carved from stone, crime began to take on new shapes molded by trade routes, expanding across continents, and by kingdoms tightening their grip on lands they scarcely understood. In the sprawling markets of Constantinople, where spices mingled with incense and mosaic light flickered across bustling crowds, a man known as Armon, the gilded thread, moved among merchants as both a respected weaver and a phantom of deception. He crafted textiles so intricate that nobles sought him out, yet beneath his loom lay hidden compartments where he smuggled forbidden letters and coded exchanges for those living under oppressive watch. His crimes reflected not greed, but a deep distrust of regimes that shaped truth like clay, and his weavings became silent acts of resistance shimmering with secrets. In the rugged hills of Wales, another soul wandered the edges of law. Rhys of the Shattered Blade, a former soldier whose loyalty had been spent in battles decided by kings far removed from blood-soaked fields. Disillusioned and burdened by memories he never wished to recall, he drifted into banditry, though his raids focused rarely on common folk and more often on caravans, carrying excessive wealth gathered through cruel taxation. Villagers whispered that he carried guilt like a second skin, and that each act he committed was driven less by survival than by a need to balance scales he had watched tilt into ruin for too long. His story reveals how war often shaped criminals, not through desire, but through the trauma of witnessing suffering rendered invisible by crowns and courts. Far across the Mediterranean, in the desert-bound strongholds of North Africa, a woman named Zara, the Sandwalker, shaped her fate with quiet precision, guiding caravans through dunes by day and intercepting corrupt tax collectors by night. Her actions earned her a place in both fear and admiration, yet her motive lay in a childhood marked by relentless scarcity and in the memory of losing siblings to the harsh whims of those who hoarded resources. With every intercepted ledger or vanished chest of coin, she sought justice in a realm where fairness had long been buried beneath layers of authority. Her tale mirrors the reality that crime often sprouted where governance grew blind. In the colder reaches of Eastern Europe, near fortified towns trembling under threat of invasion, a figure called Bogdan, the lantern-bearer, emerged in chronicles as a thief skilled in slipping through city walls during nights lit only by flickering torches. But beneath this reputation lay the quiet tragedy of a man who had once trained as a scribe, dreaming of preserving stories for generations yet found. His future destroyed when raiders attacked his village, leaving him with nothing but a lantern he carried ever since. His thefts targeted supply stores and armories, not to disrupt order, but to keep his scattered community alive through winters that devoured the unprepared. Even as authorities condemned him, his people whispered his name as a guardian formed by grief. And in the more distant trade centers of the Silk Road, a caravan guide known as Tariq of the Broken Compass earned notoriety for diverting shipments of luxury goods away from wealthy patrons and toward remote settlements neglected by empire officials. He had been praised once as a brilliant navigator, but after watching impoverished families crumble under relentless levies, he turned his skill toward redistributing wealth in ways that defied the merchants who thrived on imbalance. His path became a testament to the cost of living in a world where value was measured in gold rather than humanity. Across these lands stretching from shimmering coastlines to frozen plains, each criminal carved their place not through monstrous ambition but through experiences that reshaped their souls under the relentless pressure of survival. Their stories revealed that medieval crime was not a world of glamour nor unrestrained cruelty, but a reflection of human hearts caught between desperation and conscience, reaching for a form of justice the world too often withheld. As our journey nears its quiet conclusion, the medieval world stretches before us like a faded mural, its colors softened by centuries, yet its stories still breathing through cracks in stone and memory. Crime in this era was never simply the mark of villainy, it was the slow, trembling pulse of humanity navigating a world where justice was uneven, where hunger carved decisions sharper than any blade, and where power weighed heavier than conscience. Along the trade rivers of the Danube, a man called Emmerich the Ashbound carried a reputation sculpted by grief. Once a charcoal burner whose livelihood depended on forests that nobles claimed without warning, he watched his village scatter under forced eviction and turned to intercepting river barges loaded with timber meant for royal furnaces. Authorities branded him a threat, yet locals remembered how he often left bundles of firewood on the doorsteps of those too frail to gather their own. His life shows how crime sometimes rose from witnessing a world stripped of mercy. Farther into the heart of the Byzantine remnants, a scholar named Isidora of Thessaloniki walked the fragile boundary between law and rebellion. She forged manuscripts not to deceive for wealth, but to preserve banned philosophies threatened by political tides. Her ink carried the weight of generations, and though rulers declared her work treasonous, she believed knowledge was a flame no empire should extinguish. Her legacy whispers that even crimes against authority can be acts of devotion to truth. Moving westward through alpine paths, a figure known as Lorenzo the Stonefoot tread the perilous edges of legality as a smuggler of salt, the mineral once worth more than silver. His weary footsteps echoed through mountain passes, burdened not by greed but by the need to feed his family during seasons when famine choked entire valleys. Under harsh taxation, ordinary lives were pushed toward the shadows, and Lorenzo became one of many who turned necessity into defiance. His presence reminds us that medieval crime often sprouted from the tension between survival and systems too rigid to bend. In the fractured kingdoms of the Baltics, a woman named Anja, the Winter Rose, emerged as a quiet symbol of resistance. She stole nothing of value except prisoners locked away for debts they could never repay, guiding them through forests where snow muffled every footstep. Though chronicles condemned her as an abettor of escape, many peasants saw her as a beacon of compassion in a society where punishment weighed heavier on the poor than on the privileged. Her tale demonstrates that even in coldest lands, warmth of conscience shaped acts deemed criminal. And in the distant reaches of the Caucasus, a wanderer named Serene of the Windpath carried a legend stitched from exile, longing, and choices made beneath oppressive skies. Banished from his clan for a crime he never committed, he survived through small thefts, and by aiding travelers crossing treacherous terrain, ensuring they reached their destinations safely, even while he himself remained rootless. His existence reflects the tragedy of individuals shaped by accusations rather than actions. As these final threads weave together, they form a tapestry of medieval crime, far more human than history often portrays. These outlaws, forgers, smugglers, and wanderers were not embodiments of darkness, but reflections of a world carved by imbalance, where laws protected the powerful while ordinary people navigated a fragile existence, marked by hunger, grief, and relentless change. Their stories rise like soft echoes, reminding us that behind every act condemned by rulers lay a deeper story of survival, love, or quiet rebellion. And as centuries passed, their names dissolved into dust, yet their memories linger as lessons in humanity carved into the bones of time. The past does not judge, it simply reveals the shapes of lives lived in the margins where morality bends and resilience grows. Through them, we understand that crime in the medieval era was not merely the shadow of society, but a mirror revealing its deepest wounds and its most honest truths. And so, our journey through the lives of medieval criminals comes to an end. But history is never silent. It whispers to those who listen, and it waits for those who dare to return. In our next voyage, we will step into the forgotten libraries of ancient civilizations, another chapter carved into the stones of time. Until then, may the echoes of the past follow you into your dreams, and may you wake ready for the next legend. Good night.